This is the second part of a two-part homily. Last week, the collect raised the question, how can our land show forth God's power? How might it show God's power to create, God's power to heal, God's power to share, God's power to reconcile, God's endurance, God's love? I reminded you last week of the mission statement of this little congregation, which predates my time here, that the mission of Christ Church is to be a Christian community of faith and love, where our relationship with God is nurtured and made visible through our worship, witness, and outreach to others. Nurtured and made visible, a relationship with God. How can the land around this church support our mission? How can our land witness to our relationship with God? How can our land make the relationship between God and people visible? How can the land nurture not only the relationship with God that the people that come inside for worship have, but also others' relationship with God? We began talking about this at the 2020 annual meeting. And you recall we had these big boards with different pictures. And we divided into tables, and we talked some about what we saw there and what spoke to us. One of the pictures was this one on the left of a labyrinth. And that was something that seemed to speak to people. I would say maybe it's not just the labyrinth as such, but the idea of contemplative outdoor space, a place where you can walk in prayer, outside, enjoying the fresh air, the beauty of the earth. Another picture that seemed to speak to people was this picture of habitat for pollinators. Beauty is an intrinsic part of our worship and witness to God. Inside, we make the church beautiful. We could functionally worship in a garage, but we don't. We build something, an upturned ark, filled with the beauty of natural wood, with stained glass. Our altar gilt arranges flowers, irons linen, prepares a beautiful space for worship. Perhaps we are called to also extend that beauty outside. As we bring the outside into the sacred space here, perhaps we are also called to take the sacred into the outside space. A couple years ago, Susan Wellington led us in an exercise of looking at what values and characteristics of church this congregation particularly values. You know, there are many ways of being Christian. There are many charisms of particular communities. What is the way of this congregation. And here are some of the words that spoke to people: spirituality, beauty, welcoming, inclusive, community, contemplative, mystical, responsibility, serenity, health. How do we express these values in what we do with our land? I suggest that the concept of permaculture design is highly consistent with our values. Permaculture design is a method of landscape planning that can be applied to anything at any scale. It's an ethically based whole systems design approach to create sustainable human settlements and institutions. It's not wilderness. It's not what happens if you exclude the human dimension from a space. But it is also respecting the land, respecting the particular kind of soil and patterns of rainfall, the native plants to the place, of creating something that does not need perpetual mowing, weeding, fertilizing in order to sustain itself and be beautiful. So I have another idea, which is that we plant trees. Not just any trees, but trees as memorials. Since we met in January of 2020 and talked about our land, we and this whole world have lost many beloved people. Probably each one of you can name someone who has died in this pandemic, or who has died during this pandemic of other causes. What if we planted trees as memorials? What if we restored some of those trees that we have enjoyed the wood of in our buildings? What if we created a space of beauty and prayer using trees? Trees are comforting. As I was thinking about this, I have all of these Facebook friends around the world. One of them was in Japan visiting a place of great suffering and loss from World War II. And there are bayan trees planted there. She posted this picture of their roots. It said, "It is such a sad place. It comforted me to stand underneath this strong tree and the way it clings to the soil." But by restoring some part of the habitat, we show God's power to create and to heal. Like the trees growing again on Mount St. Helens, for which our city was named. By creating a place of habitat for the animals with which we share this space, we witness to God's love for all creation, as we do at our service of blessing of the animals. We already have deer here. We know we have deer because they used to eat our garden if the gate was ever left open. What if we looked at how do we live with the deer instead of in opposition to them? What other animals do we have here that are perhaps being squeezed out of habitat as new houses are being built? This is not a new concept that the outside can be a place of prayer. There are, for example, we know that Jesus, every day he was teaching in the temple, and at night he would go out and spend the night on the Mount of Olives. I did not realize that the Garden of Gethsemane is a place of trees. What does it mean that Jesus sought the restoration of the garden as he was teaching in the temple? What does it mean that the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, with a massive and beautiful church at his disposal, chooses to pray morning prayer in the garden? What does it mean that people all over the world have been watching the YouTube videos of the Dean in the garden with Tiger the cat, with the bird song? I think it speaks to the need for places outside for prayerful contemplation. This is part of the Christian tradition, but it's not confined to the Christian tradition. And it's something that I think we would find spiritual but not religious neighbors would also use, also appreciate. This is a post from the Graduate Theological Union, and one of the professors there on greening spirituality, religion and sustainability. This is an idea whose time is now. It could be a gift from us to our neighbors of a place where people can come, can walk, can breathe, can pray, can cry, can talk to God in their hearts. It's a gift to the world in planting trees to help offset some of the carbon load that we're putting on this planet. Like in World War II, people planted vegetable gardens any place that they could, victory gardens. Perhaps now is a time that we should all plant trees every place that we can. It's a gift of hospitality, of welcoming people who perhaps someday will come inside the church, but perhaps first will come outside. You remember the labyrinth down in Ashland, the church in Ashland, and how people who are just visitors to the city find a place of prayer, a place of refreshment at that labyrinth. Maybe we can have a place of welcome, of refreshment, of restoration, of healing here in our little corner of the church. When I interviewed for this position years ago, one of the things that the search committee asked me was to identify a favorite part of scripture and preach a very short homily on it. They gave me 10 minutes of time to prepare. I chose the first psalm. They are like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, with leaves that do not wither. Perhaps you will let me help you plant trees here by our stream, the Columbia River. Perhaps some of them will be evergreen with leaves that do not wither.